السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله. We begin in the name of Allah Azza wa Jal by asking Him to send peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May His peace and blessings be upon him and his family. I'm going to ask all the brothers to come closer in, so we can be a little bit more intimate. Also get some more steps, moving from one end of the musalla to the other. And then for the sisters, if you can, feel free to come forward, inshallah. Feel free to come forward, and then we'll hopefully have a nice conversation here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, it's wonderful to be back with everybody. I was traveling and we took some time off, and so this is somewhat summer schedule. So inshallah, the plan is we will be off next week because of 4th of July, and people hopefully will be enjoying time with their families. I believe when we come back, we'll only actually have 2 more classes remaining to actually finish the module. So we're going through the module of history of the Khulafa Rashideen, specifically of the early caliphate. And we will, I think, cover most of that. And then we may take a bit of a break for the summer, just so that we can have, inshallah, as we get into August, we'll get things more established. But I know travel schedules and children's schedules and all of that is kind of all over the place. I have to talk, by the way, I'm telling this to the administration for the first time, so, but I think our goal was always to do this in a modular fashion. So we cover things in modules. So inshallah, when we come back at the end of the summer or afterward, we'll actually start with the Umayyads. And I think that's going to be very interesting for a lot of people. And the way we'll discuss the Umayyad Caliphate is not just the Umayyad Caliphate for the first 100 years, but also the offshoot of the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain. And we'll talk about all of the civilizational advancements that happened in Spain over 400 years, or over 800 years. So we'll come into that, inshallah, a later time. I was not able to be here last week. Who was able to attend, actually, just by show of hands? Okay, so we had a few people that were attending, mashallah. Ustad Adam Dakin covered for me. We actually had coordinated in advance, and he covered, mashallah, a lot of really great material. So if you have not had the chance to listen to that class, I highly recommend going back onto Adam's Ashburn YouTube and listening to that class. What did he cover for those that were here? Say again? Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anh. And I loved his approach. We had talked about it, but he really did a great job where he talked about Umar was known for a lot of things. So let's talk about what he was the first at doing. Right? What he was the first at doing. Because when you look at the caliphate of Umar ibn Khattab, we see that he put down the groundwork not just for the Khilafah later, but actually for administrative governing bodies in general. In general. And I think I shared with you all this earlier in an earlier class, that multinational corporations today are oftentimes using the principles that Umar ibn Khattab used during his caliphate in terms of how to run a multinational corporation. That's what the Khilafah was. You had different provinces and governors, and you had to have an allegiance to a headquarters, which was in Medina, all of this. So he started putting down a lot of that framework. Now, one of the things that he mentioned, and that I think all of you saw, was during the reign of Umar ibn Khattab, the expanse of the Muslim empire was quite extensive, especially over his 10 years. If you look at a previous one, this was really at the time of Abu Bakr. What Abu Bakr as-Siddiq managed to do was unify the tribes around the Arabian Peninsula. Islam at that point was still very much an Arab phenomenon. An Arab phenomenon, right? It was in Arabia. When you get to the time of Umar ibn Khattab, you see here that now Islam has moved from outside of just Arabia into North Africa and into Iran, or what would become Persia, right? And of course covering the Levant and that entire area in the middle. This continues to happen during And it happened actually very rapidly in his time. There's a book by Hugh Kennedy. It's called The Great Arab Conquest. The Great Arab Conquest. And he talks about how one of the things that is remarkable from the perspective of Umar ibn Khattab's domain was not just that he was able to spread, but how quickly the Muslim empire spread in a very short period of time. Right? This is actually one of the miracles, and Ustad Adam Dakin mentioned that this is not just from Umar, this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes? Mm-hmm. Good question. So at the end, the brother asked me, at the end of the time of Rasulullah, it was basically almost the same, right? So Islam had spread into the Jazirat al-Arab. What Umar, but it was still it was fragmented. It was tribes and like mini cities around there. What Abu Bakr did was just get it all unified. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, in Abu Bakr's time, one of the things that's really interesting is if you look at the Prophet's life, he stood to abolish all forms of shirk and idolatry. That was the main objective, if you will, abolish idolatry. By the time of Abu Bakr's reign, there was nobody, not one individual that brought a new idol into Arabia. Not one. At that point, idolatry was abolished. In fact, what did Abu Bakr have to deal with? And actually Umar even after him. False prophets. People that declared themselves to be prophet. Right? That's what they had. Aswad al-Unsi, Musaylim al-Kadhab. These are people. So the idea of idolatry was gone. It no longer existed and has not existed since then. The Prophet ﷺ's mission to abolish idolatry, that was accomplished. And such to the point that Abu Bakr would later note, and he would say, notice how now there's been no other attempts at idolatry since the time of Rasulullah ﷺ. Instead, there were people that brought like false messages, false prophets, and he had to deal with that. But during this time now, Umar's time, we begin to see this expansion out into the broader kind of areas around the Persian and the Byzantine Empire. One thing that happens during his time was that because it was so rapid, as armies came back with treasury and with wealth, much of the Muslim public would become quite prosperous because of that. So they got used to Muslims going out there and winning battles and then bringing the war spoils home. Right? That just became kind of part of the process. What we'll see, inshallah ta'ala, in today's class, and there's a lot, by the way, to discuss, because unlike the others, the longest reigning of the Khulafa Rashidin was Uthman ibn Affan. 13 years he was a Khalifa. Right? So what we have here in his Khilafah is we'll have a lot of things that will come up, issues that the previous Khalifas did not know or did not have to deal with, right? So, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. First, let's begin with Uthman ibn Affan's ascension into Khilafah. How was he decided? How was Umar ibn Khattab selected on as prophet? Selected on as Khalifa? Abu Bakr nominated him. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq nominated him, and basically everybody kind of fell into line. Now, Umar ibn Khattab, after he's fatally stabbed by Abu Lu'lu, right, what does he do? He actually sets up a council of his trustworthy people and says, let there be a Khalifa from amongst the six of you, right? So there are people who were identified as being part of that And I want to give you guys the 6 names because they're all names that you have recognized before. But these are the 6 people that were chosen to become either a Khalifa or to choose amongst themselves who the Khalifa would be. They were the following individuals, he said. Yes. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Uthman ibn Affan, Zubayr ibn Awam, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't have his last name here, Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, and Abdullah ibn Umar. So, did I, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yes, those are the 6. And then there were some people that were considered like advisors. Sa'id ibn Zayd, for instance, was one of them, Amr ibn al-As. But amongst them, he said, okay, you are the 6, choose amongst yourself who it will be. Now, I'm not going to go into the details about what happened, how it happened, and, but the tiebreaker, because there's 6 of them, the tie-breaking vote, Umar ibn Khattab said would go to Abdurrahman ibn Auf. In other words, count his vote higher than the votes of the others. Okay? There was some debate amongst the council who should be in line next, who should take on the mantle next. After some back and forth, it came down to Uthman ibn Affan. Ali ibn Abi Talib, in some narrations, he had some hesitancy with this. Namely, he was 68 years old, he was much older, right? And there was some he wanted to make sure, but he did eventually agree. Like there was no like, oh no, I'm going to challenge you for the caliphate, right? When the other advisors had said, this is our nominee, we're putting forth this nominee, he himself, Uthman ibn Affan, didn't want the job, right? And he even mentioned it as such in his inaugural address, a piece of which is quoted here, right? A piece of that quote is here. Oh people, it is not easy to manage a new horse. If God willing I live, there will be several other occasions to talk to you. Right now I cannot address you. Know that I'm not good at making public speeches, right? So you could see even the weight of this coming down on him. Uthman ibn Affan, to be clear, was a remarkable Sahabi, known at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, known as one of the earliest converts to Islam, right? Known as Dhun Nurayn, the possessor of the 2 lights, because he married 2 of the daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He married one, Ruqayya, and then after she died, he married later Kulthum. He was very close to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's family, right? And there's many, many virtues and hadith and things like that that we can go into about Uthman ibn Affan. But he was known for his modesty, his haya. He was known as a very kind of self-reflective individual. He came from noble lineage of Banu Umayyah, of the Umayyad clan. So he's well known amongst the Quraysh, right? So of these 6 individuals, he was the one that was nominated and put forth, and the others agreed. They said, okay, he will be, going forward, he will be our Khalifa. And this would be the case, inshallah ta'ala, for the remainder part of his Khilafah. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of details in his caliphate. There's a lot that transpires over 1,300 years, or excuse me, over 13 years. We're not going to be able to get into all those details, but I did want to extract some of the lessons that we can have from his caliphate for us. Yes, brother?
But this council happened while Umar was still alive.
He appointed the council, correct. He appointed the council. Whether they were chosen, I don't remember if he had passed before they were chosen. Let me actually check to see if they have that in the book. Yeah, actually, interesting note on Umar ibn Khattab. I forgot to mention this. When Umar ibn Khattab was requested to nominate somebody as Khalifa, he said it would be valid for me if I nominated anyone as Khalifa following the way of Abu Bakr. However, if I were to nominate a Khalifa, he would be Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah. So his pick, if he were given a choice, would have been Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah. Now, the problem, of course, was that Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, he died during the plague of Amwas in Syria. So he was no longer alive. And people don't, oftentimes, he's not oftentimes a name that we think about when it comes to really famous Sahabi, but Abu Ubaidah was a remarkable individual for his generosity, for even he was actually injured to a point where in battle where he would limp often. He had a very pronounced limp in that, and yet was known for his piety. He said, he's a person that I would have chosen, but he has returned to Allah before me. Same with Salim, the slave of Abu Hudayfa, but he too died before me. So again, he had in his mind people that he would have liked to have put forth, but they were no longer there. Whether or not, I can't recall offhand, whether Umar ibn Khattab, however, died before the council had decided. Yeah, we can circle back on it, exactly. Yeah, I'll have to check into that to see. But at least for the people that were alive during the council, this was, once it was decided it was Uthman, they said, okay, we'll move forward with Uthman. Now, a couple of things to note here. Number one, during his governance, right, during the governance of Uthman ibn Affan, one of the things that he's accused of later on and over time is nepotism. Everybody here know what nepotism is? What is nepotism? Idris, what's nepotism? There you go. You get the job because you know somebody, not because you're the most qualified person. This still happens, by the way, a lot, right? So one of the things that Uthman ibn Affan did during his Khilafat, and actually, you know what, let me go back. Before I go into this, I want to just talk a little bit about the map here. One of the things that we have to recognize, I'm going to get up and walk around. Islam at this point is spreading into new areas. These new areas do not have Sahaba with them. What do I mean by that? When you go into North Africa, and eventually they get down into Ethiopia, there's not people that have lived with the Prophet ﷺ at that point. It's kind of loud. The same when you get over into Persia. Right now you're in an area where there's not a known quantity of people that met with the Prophet ﷺ. During the Khilafah of Omar, he lived in Medina. He lived with the Sahaba themselves, right? As the armies start to spread out, they begin to experience new things and new ideas and even new fiqh that they didn't have to worry about in Medina. This is part of what we have to understand as Islam spreads. It's spreading over time and space. Spreading over time, now we're a decade and a half, 2 decades after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, as well as space in terms of the areas. Yes, Raheem? They're the ones spreading it, right? So you're getting into a generation now where the people have met the Sahaba, and they're the ones that are now spreading Islam. And again, they're doing a great job at that. But one thing to also note is something I mentioned in the very first class. The vast majority of the general public that lives here is not Muslim. The rulers are Muslim, the governors are Muslim, the people administering the state affairs are Muslim, but no one else. So outside of the Arabian Peninsula here, you don't really have a mass conversion to Islam happening in Africa. You don't have a mass conversion to Islam happening in Iran or in Persia. You don't have a mass conversion to Islam happening in Byzantium. That does not happen. Historical records have proven that out, that was not the case. In fact, in many areas, and I think Hugh Kennedy talks about this in his book, the only reason we even know that there were Arabs in North Africa is because those countries today speak Arabic. Otherwise, the vast majority of people, it's not like they have Arab lineage, right? They were Egyptians, they were Tunisians, they just all speak Arabic today. So we know the influence that the Arabs had in that area and in that region. Yes, Jibril. Good question. The empire, so these lines are very fluid. So the caliphate was responsible for this area. Could it have gone a little bit more to the right? Yes. Could it have been a little bit more to probably yes. But there weren't borders the way, like right now, if you look on a map, you see these borders. Those borders didn't exist. Good. Any other questions on this? Remember this concept of Islam spreading over time and space. It's going to become very, very important. Because what happens is now you have indigenous people in Persia or in Byzantium that are becoming Muslim, that don't have necessarily the background that the Sahaba did. So now they're having to teach them about these backgrounds. They're having to teach them about this is our understanding. But you guys understand how this is a new reality that you didn't have to deal with in Medina. Right? Okay. Yeah, I mean, they go into the 13th year. Yeah. So, okay. So, when we talk about the ascension of the Umayyads who would come later on, they oftentimes look back into the governorship of the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan to give themselves kind of the justification as to why they're there. The Umayyads themselves were very, especially this early period of Umayyads, but people from Banu Umayyah were very good administrators. So people like Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, right, the son of Abu Sufyan, he was the governor and appointed the governor of Syria and governed there for, I think last night, I don't remember the exact numbers, over 2 decades. Why? Because he was very good at his job. It is not easy to, anybody who's been in positions of leadership, you have to deal with different personalities and responsibilities and all of this kind of stuff. He was very good at that. And that's why it's not just that he was governor of Syria, it's that the people of Syria gave him governorship. They acknowledged him as the ruler for them, right? That happens, he also happened to be Uthman's cousin, right, just by lineage. And then there were other cousins who were also appointed in Iraq, in the Persian lands, to this, again, over the Sassanids. In fact, I actually was, when I was preparing for this morning, I looked into some of the complaints that people would lodge against Uthman ibn Affan. One of them was the following: you have conferred power and rules on your relatives. For instance, you have appointed Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan governor of entire Syria. You made Abdullah ibn Amr governor of Basra by deposing Abu Musa al-Ashari. You installed Walid ibn Uqba and then Sa'id ibn As governors of Kufa by removing Mughira ibn Shuba. Uthman ibn Affan replied and he said, those governors are not my relatives and they have ability to manage affairs well. What is Uthman saying here? He's saying that, look, first of all, they're not my brother and sister, right? They're distant cousins, but more importantly, they're good at what they do. They are good at what they do. They manage the affairs well. But, however, if they don't deserve the post, I am always ready to change them out for others. Thus, I have already put Abu Musa al-Ashari as the governor of Kufa by removing Sa'id ibn al-As. So he, again, from his perspective, he said, look, yes, these people of Quraysh are related to me, but they're also very good at their jobs. What this did, however, over a period of a decade plus, is start to breed resentment amongst certain groups of people that said, hey, these people have been in power too long. And it's interesting, if you look at it even in today's world, the presidency of the United States of America is 8 years at most. Unless Trump tries to change something, right? But at most, constitutionally, it's 8 years. You have 2 4-year terms. I've noticed historically, if you look at areas, other parts of the world, where any leader is in for around 10 years or more, they end up becoming dictators. Even if they start off well-intentioned. By the time you're in power for a decade, you're kind of de facto in power and going to keep yourself there. So I think there is some, it's just again, there's nothing Islamic about that. It's just an interesting point in history that, you stay under that 10-year mark and you're generally accepted as like, okay, this is, there's people, that's enough time to affect change and to do things in society. But you get over 10 years and people start seeing you as the problem, right, in general. Yes? That's maybe in his own mind, but yeah. He was 100% involved. And that's in a Jazakallah khair, thank you for bringing that up. I think unfortunately in the modern narrative, especially the kind of the Sunni Shia narrative, there's this idea that Ali ibn Abi Talib removed himself from any of the administrations because he didn't agree with them. Nothing could be further from the truth. Ali himself was involved in each of these Shura councils. Again, he's chosen by Omar to be part of one of the six. Amongst yourselves, choose. That's how intimately he was involved with the affairs. For Abu Bakr, for Omar, and even for something controversial that will have happened during the time of Uthman. So he's there as part of the administration. He's there as part of the Shura Council. It's not that he has seceded from society and said, I don't want anything to do with this. Right? He's there to advise and to continue there. So this is happening, and I want to give this context, that this idea of nepotism, this idea of, from Uthman ibn Affan's perspective, yes, I have put governors in charge, but they are also the most qualified people to be in charge. And where they're not qualified, I change them out. That's his kind of justification. The other thing to just notice is that Islam, as I mentioned, started to spread significantly during this time. Now, it did spread less than it did during the time, like during Umar's time, it was exponential. But what happened was, Uthman now, it becomes less, like it's more incremental in value, which means there's less money coming into the treasury. This starts to breed resentment within some of the Muslims. Like, hey, why aren't we expanding at the rate that we used to? Where is all the money that used to come into us? Why have we started to plateau? Right? Again, these are things that weren't an issue during the time of Umar al-Khattab, weren't even an issue during the time of Abu Bakr. He was just trying to consolidate and solidify. So there's a slower expansion, there's fewer battles, and that means that there's less money coming in via battles, which means there's more economic stagnation. So people started to get upset. Right? I wanted to just lay down the framework as to why people are upset. However, one of the ingenious things that he did was he created the first naval fleet in Islam. The naval fleet in Islam. These were desert-dwelling Arabs. Making boats was not their thing, right? But as you conquer into Byzantium and get into the Levant and into Syria and into Palestine, into those areas, now you've got a coastline that you need to defend and from which you can go and give dawah, right? So what does he do? He actually launches campaigns against Cyprus and Crete, which were Byzantine strongholds at that point, and conquers them during his Khilafah, right? During his Khilafah, there's also the conquering of Khurasan in 651, which is the deeper part of Persia. So all of this is happening in this time. And then he even has armies that he sends to Anatolia and Armenia, into the Turkish, into kind of what we would consider today the Turkish homeland. So the spreading Islam is still very much a part of the ethos within the Arab Empire. Right? Again, there are problems that come up with this. There are problems that come, especially when you start going into lands where people aren't natively speaking Arabic, aren't natively familiar with Islam, as it were. Yes, brother. Say again? Why were they conquered? Oh, this is a great question. There is a very good paper that's been written by Dr. Jackson about the need for jihad in the medieval time, in the eminent time, in the pre-modern time. Again, something I discussed in the first class. If you are not conquering, you are being conquered. That's simply the way, the laws of empires. In today's world, the general state of the world is that there's peace in the world and you have to declare war. In the pre-modern world, across the board, you were in a state of war until you declared peace. So what would happen was these armies would go out there in order to defend kind of the borderlines. They would have to, there was kind of this offensive, we're striking you, you're striking us. This is the normative kind of affair. 100%. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it does. And I think the answer is all of the above. I think one big driver historically has been dawah. Look, you have to spread Islam. That was very clear from their message. Islam is not supposed to be something that's just meant for Arabians. It's meant to be for all of humanity. So you spread that. Now you could argue, okay, they're spreading that through trade, they're spreading that through other things. Well, I'm just saying that's one narrative. That's one narrative that's been out there is, okay, yeah, there's dawah. But these guys have an empire to run. That's, 100%. That's it. Yeah. Well, you're assuming the border is stagnant. The border is forever expanding. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ, and by the way, what you just said is not technically a true statement because the Prophet ﷺ did assign an army to go out to Byzantium. Of course, there's always a reason. But what I'm saying is, again, he could have said, hey, I need to just keep it here, guys. We need to consolidate the Arabian tribes. But there was a drive to make sure that if we have to continue to spread. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's even simpler than that. You're an empire. That's how you get money. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, to be clear, I hope everybody understands that is what we're talking about is the civilization of Islam. There are people who are going to spread dawah, right? But they're yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, again, Hugh Kennedy makes this a point that how many cities willfully, without resistance, gave themselves over to the Muslims. This happened, by the way, all of North, and if you look at this map in North Africa, here, yes, we conquered Cairo, sure, there's a battle for Fustat. Beyond that, there's very little empirical evidence that he was able to uncover that shows that there were battles that were fought. Why? Because these cities willfully gave themselves over to a just ruler, or something a system that they thought was more just than the oppression they were under before. You're asking the question as if there's an answer. So what's your answer to that? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, well, but it's not true. See, I think this is what I'm saying. I think the answer is all of the above. You had people who did want to go and spread Islam, like give dawah, and they can do that in multiple different ways. You could do that. Right. You could 100%. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 100%. And this is why if dawah were the only thing that they were doing, then why would it have taken them 300 years to make these places Muslim? So what they're doing is conquering lands, I think, to build civilization. Yeah. There are things that Islamic empire has done in order to maintain empire. Well, I mean, the Ottomans were notorious for this. The Ottomans, we'll discuss much later, right? They did things that you and I would find abhorrent, but they did it to solidify empirical power. I mean, when a caliph takes over when a person is declared sultan, all of his brothers and half-brothers are killed. Right, but that has everything to do with empire building, right? And that's why that empire lasted 500 years, because they had a very regimented system of how that worked. So even here, they were either going to be crushed or they had to go out and conquer, but this is also how you pay for the state. That's a deeper question. The question of loyalty to a khalifa is a fiqhi question. And at least in the Sunni tradition, they're pretty clear on what the answer is to that fiqhi question. The Shia tradition is different, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, when it comes to administering a state and a political entity, there are people who they were good at it. And in the case of the Umayyads, and in the case of Muawiyah in particular, he had a loyalty with his people. And that will manifest itself in a number of different ways when we get into kind of what happened between Muawiyah and Ali. The reality is, again, empire building it's messy. A lot of it is messy. And they're just getting their feet wet with how to do this. And they're recognizing that, hey, there are areas where we need to be on the offensive to make sure that we're protecting our borders. Crete and Cyprus are nowhere near Medina. Crete and Cyprus but they are very close to the Levant, right? And when you sanction an army or a navy fleet to go in and kind of conquer those lands. What does the scholar say? I mean, that's a question for the scholars to determine. Do you have a question? Yeah. And the fighting. Do you think they were fighting not thinking it was jihad? Yeah. What, you have a question on it? You did? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he invited them to Islam. He said, look, this is what I'm inviting you. So again, I think what we're talking about is the need for land and expansion versus bringing people to Islam, right? I mean, Allahu Alam, right? I'm not sure what the internal motivations was for a lot of these people. I think we can just look back on it civilizationally and say, this was the way in which you're going to continue to sustain that expansion is by continuing to, you're ruling over people. You have, yeah. It's a totally different context than what we have today. I think the brother brings up a good point, which is, was it all altruistic? I think it could be, who knows, right? Maybe they were doing it for dawah, but there's a lot of other ways to give dawah, right? And trade is what historically has been the way in which the dawah has continued. But I don't necessarily I think there was in general an expansionary mindset that was part and parcel of that people. Right? In the same way, Ibn Battuta, what possessed him to travel 75,000 miles? Nobody else did. There was a clear? Is your premise, though, that there is no longer a clear threat? By the time you get to here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, 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 yeah. So what, but, right, you don't think there's a clear threat here, though? Do you think there's a clear threat here? I would argue that the Khalifas thought that this was a clear threat. Yeah. No, no, it's an empirical, I thought I did. So, okay, let me again. The empirical threat is the fact that you are always at war, period. So that means that you're either defending, that's, yeah, but nobody's fighting it. No, no, but nobody's fighting in Medina. Nobody's fighting in Kufa. Nobody's fighting in Baghdad. Nobody's fighting in these areas. I'm talking about Cyprus and Crete. But, until civil war, yeah. But that's what I'm saying. Like, I guess what we're just talking about expansion. And your question is about why did they expand? Because there was an existential threat. That's why they're expanding. You're constantly at war. That's why they're expanding. That's the default state. That's what I'm trying to say. I thought I mentioned it. Look, I think you can. I mean, I don't know. I think I'm just, maybe it's my perspective, but is everybody else kind of following me here? Or is this, yeah, like the default state of the world was one of war. That's common here. Idris, and then Raheem. Yeah, might is right. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, in the way in the laws of empires, that's 100% how it works, right? You're kind of always expanding. You're always pushing. What drove the Mongols? Hey, I'm just going to go and continuously just take over as much as I can, right?
And not necessarily every conquest was in line with Islamic principles.
Of course.
Then they
Oh,
made a lot of mistakes.
well, yes, definitely. I wouldn't say, and this is, I think, is the brother's point, is everything considered jihad? That's questionable, right? That's questionable. I don't know. I don't know if everything is justified in that sense or not. They might have thought it was, right? But it's the same arguments today, right, that you'd have. People are like, oh, is this a justifiable war to be involved in, right? I don't think anybody would have argued against when the Afghan-Russo war was happening. Everybody felt like, no, this is them defending their land and their people and their faith against the Russians, right? People would argue afterward, is that still the case? Especially when the infighting happens, where now you have Afghan warlords that are fighting with each other. Like, is this actually jihad anymore? Because now it's different, right? There was definitely an expansionary mindset, and what's unique is the fact that the Arabs didn't have it before. The Arabs were very content being little municipalities of tribes. Yathrib did not want to go and take over. Yeah, I guess technically Abraha did want to take over, but he had a religious reason for doing that, right? Yemen, for instance. But once you start poking the bear, being Persia and Byzantium, you're going to end up having to fight those all the time. I don't know if that helps. Let me just do this because I know we're going to run out of time here because there's the sister's halakha that starts. One of the major contributions during the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan that cannot be underscored enough is something that you and I benefit from to this day, and that's the Uthmani Quran. The actual codex, the actual written scripture of the Quran as it is today, existed at this time. It was compiled, at the time of Uthman ibn Affan. There's a whole story behind how it was compiled. I don't have time to get into kind of the details around that. But one thing that we have to just recognize is that prior to this point, there were different quote-unquote versions of the Quran. What do I mean by versions? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was a great Sahabi, had himself a script, a codex that was from the Prophet ﷺ, from his time. And these were people that by and large committed things to memory. So written context was not the norm, right? Written was something that you would have, again, if somebody has blessed something for you, or in this case, he had it from the Prophet ﷺ, so he wanted to keep it. What Uthman essentially did was, after getting a council of people together saying, we've spread into these different areas of the world, they're pronouncing things differently and wrong. They're making interpretations that are wrong. I'm seeing versions of Quranic script that isn't Quran. How do we abate this? How do we make this standard and uniform? And one of the things that he did was implement this standardization process by which every mushaf that was not considered the codex was burned, including that of people like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who, by the way, is a great scholar and a great Sahabi, who was not happy with this decision. He didn't want to burn something that he himself got from the Prophet ﷺ, or at least was done in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, but this was the mandate. People would challenge later on, even the time of Ali, at the time of Ali when he's Khalifa, they would say, Uthman, don't you know he's the one that made us burn our Qur'ans? That was one of the accusations that they hurled against him. Ali himself said, I was standing right there with him when that decision was made. In other words, don't separate me from that. We all agreed this is what needs to happen. And that standardization is why we have one text today for the Quran. One text. And there's, not to get into kind of a class on Quran sciences, but there's different narrations of how to recite the Quran, what they call the ahruf, right? The 7 different recitations. All of those recitations are found in this one script. So it was a way for him to kind of combine the different narrations of how to recite into one codex. Yes, Ray. Good question. You had a lot of hufaz, right? Because most people had memorized much of it, but then there were those that had specific, kind of specific chapters memorized. This was a way for them to check and balance to make sure that these narrations are correct. It was Umar's daughter that had a version of it, and he said, okay, we're going to, I don't remember the exact story, but essentially use this. So because Hafsa had a codex that had started to be put together during the time of Umar ibn Khattab. No, no. What was straight from the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was the hifz of the Quran. That's direct. As far as an actual manuscript, none existed, to our knowledge. Yamama, yes. The Battle of Yamama is where, and I think Adam may have mentioned it last time, that's where many of the Hufaz were killed. So the process of preserving, what does it look like to preserve the Quran, make sure it's written down, all of that started during this time. By the time it got to Uthman, there were so many variations. He said, no, we need to purge all these variations and bring down one standard text. Yes. Orders was wrong. Yeah, no, he's right. He's right. They were written in different scripts that were pronounced differently. So that became a problem. No. Okay.
The way that the scripture was from 7 different scripts,
Narrations, yeah.
narrations, that came during Prophet's time. There were
Yes,
other people that
yes.
spoke different ways, so they include everybody in that aspect. From what I understand, that was put into text,
Yes.
but the order was changed. The order of the revelation, right? During Prophet's time, the order of the revelation was certainly in a different way. Even if you look at the Quran today, you see that this surah was revealed
Yeah, yeah, Makkah and Medina, yes.
this time and this time. So the order was still this time.
No, that we do believe, the Sunni tradition believes that that is from the Prophet ﷺ. So the actual like placement of the surahs, as we have in the Mus'haf, comes from the Prophet ﷺ. The order of revelation, that's different, right? So even, actually interesting side point, but even the earliest translations of Quran into English, like if you go back to like the 1800s, they actually did it translated based on the order of revelation. They didn't do it based on how we have in the Mus'haf today. But the actual where the surah belongs and where the verses belong in the surahs, we believe that that was during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So in his last Ramadan, where he was asked to recite to Jibreel alayhi salam twice the entire Mus'haf end to end, right? That was done in the order that we do it in Tarawih today. Does that make sense?
It's funny you got onto that because I was having this discussion with somebody from the other belief, and they were telling me that if we talk about that,
Yeah.
this is part of it, right?
No. The bid'ah may be the actual writing of it. That could be considered a bid'ah because it wasn't written in that scriptural form. It was memorized and passed along in that form.
But the order was
The order is meant, yeah. We believe, our tradition believes that that was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Definitely through the, especially in his last year. Yes, it is.
So all the time with the Quran, oftentimes when Christians say like, why Islam, how say the Quran, some of those literate, some of those literate. They'll try to tell me Muhammad wasn't so it was not he was literate, he was left. Are there actual historical sources other than the hadith in the Quran saying that he is illiterate, which actually like reference what they do know?
It's a good question. Saying that he was unlettered?
No, say that he was literate. As like, oh, he could read and write. That's like basically saying the Quran is a fabrication of him. They disagree that he was illiterate. Because we say he is illiterate, they say.
Yeah, so in a society like today where everything is documented and written out, that's the problem is most prehistoric societies or pre-modern societies didn't have this type of documentation. So how is tradition passed on? Orally. And in many cases, there's a whole book written called Moonwalking by Einstein that's a really interesting book about oral traditions and how they are better at preserving history than written ones because written things can get lost over time. Oral tradition is passed on generation to generation to generation. That was the society in which the Prophet ﷺ grew. So did he have a degree, a formal degree of education from anywhere? No. Vast majority of people at that time did not. Right? Unless you were a scribe, like unless that was your job, was to write things down, you didn't need to do it. You could sign your name, anybody can kind of sign your name on something, but that wasn't what's considered. That's just, again, going back to kind of that warring thing, right? State of war, like the state of the world at that time was not, it was an oral culture. Oral cultures operate very differently than written ones. Go ahead. We have to be careful using the word illiterate because illiterate assumes that there's a lack of knowledge, right? That's why I don't use that word. Even when it comes to the Prophet ﷺ, I've heard unlettered and other words, right? But illiteracy in our context means that there's not. They had different ways of passing on knowledge. That knowledge was spread orally, not written. That wasn't the norm. People did it, but it wasn't the norm. Unless it was for a contract. Like it had to be for specific reasons, right? Like that's why Allah tells us in the Quran, write your contracts down, right? Have something that you can like look at. Don't just do it orally, right? But even then, make sure you have witnesses, right? There are things that require and necessitated it, but everything wasn't documented via writing. Yes, brother. Yes. So there you go, Idris. That's,
So, again, a lot of people say he's unliterate,
mm,
which he's not reading the whole recital. The time of the idea, the subject of the
yeah.
starting reciting evidence. Hey, look, the prophet says to Ali, show me where this word is written so I can cross it out. First of all, that was done inside the tent at night. It's way later than that. Right? And that
Mhm.
occurs when they go back to the so to state that the prophet is unlettered is a big mistake because he is talking to Jibreel,
Mhm.
and Jibreel, Rasulullah made sure the Quran was documented correctly because if you read the Mus'haf,
Mhm.
there are words that are written in two different ways. Okay? And if the prophet didn't know how to do it, why would he have it in this way or that way?
And one of the things to just recognize, though, is I think we need to just be clear that the Quran, as it's passed down through generation after generation after generation, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ up until now, is not written in that sense. Like there wasn't a, you didn't have to write the Quran to get an ijazah, for instance, not until much later on. It's an orally passed book. Even the isnad that you get all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, you have to make sure that it's orally transmitted. And that's an important point because that oral transmission is how later on we would accept things like hadith and things like that. It was via oral transmission. It's not weaker than writing it down. Today, we oftentimes think about that. Oh, this is just what somebody said or somebody did. When you're telling a story, if you tell it wrong, there's 10 million other people around you that know that exact same story that can call you out on it being wrong. Yes or no? That's how oral tradition works. Everybody follow me on that? Right? At the time of why does Imam Malik, for instance, say that, hey, praying with my hands by my side is an acceptable practice? Not because there's a hadith about it, but because he saw 10,000 people in Medina praying that way. And he's like, that's the sunnah. What I'm looking at, what I'm seeing lived is more of a sunnah. What I'm seeing having been transmitted orally and in action to these people over 2 or 3 generations, that's the sunnah, right? So it's not just that, oh, there's no hadith about it. He doesn't need that hadith. It doesn't need anything that's written down that says that this is the way it was done. So the written down part is oftentimes as a verification. I agree with that. It's not the way it was mass transmitted. Not until you get to the time of Uthman, and then it starts becoming more and more prevalent. Yeah. 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 And, oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I don't recall that there was a full mushaf. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it was not a full mushaf. Right, right. Yeah, yeah. That's true. That I can agree with. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it was documented. Yeah, that's true. But again, the veracity for that documentation was an oral kind of acceptance of like, are these what it is? Did they look for? I mean, I guess the question is. It was not. Yeah, it was not. I guess I'm more concerned with how it was passed down. It was not passed down via documentation, to my knowledge, at least from what I have studied with my scholars. Yeah, because he didn't. Yeah. Yeah, they didn't, I mean, I don't think any of them did that. Yeah, so you're saying that as long as there were pieces of paper that had different versions of the surahs on them? Okay. Okay, yeah. That's what he's suggesting, yeah. Yeah. He's, he's saying the definition of the word ummi.